The airport was crowded that afternoon, people rushing in every direction with luggage rolling behind them, announcements echoing over the loudspeakers, and the smell of coffee drifting from nearby stalls. In the middle of all the noise and hurry, a soldier walked quietly toward his gate. His uniform was neat but slightly worn from long service, his boots polished but carrying the weight of countless miles traveled. He carried only a single duffel bag, heavy but manageable. The kind of bag a man packs when he has learned to live with only what he needs. He had just returned from a long deployment overseas. Months away from his family, months of sleeping in tents and working in dangerous places. This flight wasn't just another trip for him, it was the first step toward going home. Toward seeing his loved ones again, toward peace. His eyes looked tired, but behind them was a quiet strength. The kind that comes only from sacrifice. When he reached the counter, the flight attendant greeted him with a warm smile. She checked his ticket and nodded. "You've been upgraded, sir. Or first class." Her voice was kind, respectful, and her words carried more weight than she realized. The airline often honored soldiers this way, offering them small comforts. In return for their service, for the soldier, it wasn't about luxury, it was about finally being able to sit back, stretch his legs, and rest after months of hardship. He thanked her politely, his voice calm, almost shy, and walked toward the jet bridge inside the plane. Passengers were already finding their seats, overhead bins filling up quickly. The soldier moved carefully down the aisle, his presence quiet but noticeable. Some passengers glanced at him and smiled with gratitude, whispering a quick thank you as he passed. Others didn't look up at all, lost in their phones or their conversations. He didn't mind. He never expected recognition. He had done his duty, and that was enough. When he reached the first-class cabin, he paused, scanning the rows. The seats looked wide and comfortable, the kind he had only seen when passing through to economy on previous flights. This time, though, one of them had his name on it. He slipped his bag into the overhead compartment, careful not to disturb anyone, and lowered himself into the seat. For the first time in a long while, his body relaxed. He leaned back and exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief that he could sit in comfort, even if only for a few hours around him. Passengers chatted quietly. A businessman flipped through documents. A young couple whispered about their vacation plans. And a well-dressed woman adjusted her silk scarf as she scrolled through her tablet. Everyone seemed busy, important in their own way, but the soldier simply sat still, grateful for the moment of peace. As the cabin filled, the woman across from him glanced in his direction. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a hint of disapproval flickering across her face. She noticed his uniform, noticed the duffel bag, and frowned as if something about him being there unsettled her. Hush. The soldier didn't notice at first. He was looking out the window, watching the airport crew move on the tarmac, thinking about how close he was to home. The attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks, checking seatbelts. Everything seemed ordinary, routine. The soldier sat quietly, his hands folded, his mind drifting to thoughts of family, his mother's cooking, his father's firm handshake, his little sister's smile. He wondered if they would be at the airport waiting for him, holding a sign, waving from the crowd. His heart softened at the thought. For him, this flight was more than travel. It was a passage from one world to another, from danger to safety. From duty to love. He didn't need applause or recognition. All he wanted was a safe trip and the comfort of being one step closer to home. But not everyone shared his quiet gratitude. As the engines roared to life and the plane prepared to take off, the well-dressed woman across from him kept glancing his way. Her frown deepened, her lips pressed tightly together. She shifted in her seat as though uncomfortable with the idea of sharing this space with him. The soldier didn't notice. Not yet. He was too lost in his own thoughts, too tired to see the storm that was slowly forming just a few feet away. The plane lifted off, the city shrinking below as the clouds swallowed the view. The soldier closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engines lull him into calm. He didn't know that soon his peace would be disturbed. He didn't know that the woman who had been staring at him with disapproval would soon speak up, loudly and sharply, questioning his place in that seat. He didn't know that her words would not only challenge him, but also expose something deeper about respect, humility, and the truth of who he was. For now, though, he sat quietly, unaware of what was coming. Unaware that someone else on the plane, sitting just a few rows behind, was already watching closely, taking in every detail of what would soon unfold. The soldier sat quietly in his seat, his eyes still gazing out of the small oval window. The clouds rolled beneath the plane like a soft white ocean, endless and calm. For him, it felt like the first real breath of peace he had taken in months. He wasn't thinking about luxury or comfort. He wasn't comparing himself to anyone else in that cabin. He was just grateful for the stillness, for the soft seat beneath him, and for the knowledge that he was finally going home. But across the aisle, a woman watched him with growing irritation. She was dressed in an expensive suit, her nails polished to perfection, a golden watch glittering on her wrist. Her hair was styled neatly, not a strand out of place, and her perfume lingered heavily in the air. To her, first class was not just a seat, was a symbol, place reserved for people like her, people who she believed had earned it through wealth, success, and status. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the soldier's uniform, the patches, the creases, the worn fabric. In her mind, he didn't belong there. To her, his presence was an intrusion. She shifted in her seat, crossing her legs, pulling her designer scarf closer to her neck as if to shield herself from him. The soldier, lost in his own thoughts, didn't notice. He didn't see the way she stared. He didn't hear the sharp, little sighs she let out every time he shifted in his seat. He wasn't aware that in her eyes, he was out of place. To him, it was simple. His boarding pass said first class. So that was where he sat. The woman leaned slightly toward the flight attendant passing by. Her voice was sharp, dripping with condescension. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Is this correct? This man," she gestured with a manicured hand toward the soldier, "is sitting in first class. Is that allowed?" The attendant blinked, taken aback, but remained polite. "Yes, ma'am. His seat is assigned here." The woman frowned deeply, her lips pursing. "Assigned? To him?" She let out a short, incredulous laugh, as though the very idea was absurd. "First class is for business travelers, for professionals. Surely he should be in economy where people like him belong." Several passengers shifted uncomfortably at her words. Some glanced at the soldier, waiting to see if he would respond. But he didn't. He kept his eyes lowered, his hands resting calmly on his lap. He wasn't interested in arguments. He had faced worse things than insults. If moving would avoid a scene, he would move. His silence wasn't weakness, it was humility. The woman mistook his quietness for guilt. She straightened. In her seat, emboldened. "You see? He doesn't even deny it. He knows he doesn't belong here. It's insulting, really. First class is meant for those who've worked hard, not..." She paused, her eyes flicking over his uniform with disdain. "Not for people who spend their time playing soldier." The soldier's jaw tightened, but he didn't look at her. He had learned long ago that words could wound, but they couldn't break him unless he let them. He remembered his father's voice when he was young. True strength is measured by silence when others expect anger. He chose silence now. The woman, however, wasn't done. She turned her head toward the other passengers, raising her voice. As though seeking agreement, "Don't you all think so? Shouldn't seats like this be for paying customers? Not, she waved her hand dismissively. Charity cases? The businessman beside her shifted uncomfortably, pretending to focus on his laptop. The young couple across the aisle looked down at their hands, unwilling to meet her gaze. Most of them wanted the scene to end quickly. Few had the courage to speak. The soldier stood slowly, his movements calm, deliberate. Without looking at the woman, he reached for his duffel bag from the overhead compartment. The leather handle was worn, the bag heavy with his belongings. He pulled it down quietly and stepped aside. "I can move," he said softly, his voice respectful but steady. "It's no trouble." His words silenced the murmurs around them. Some passengers looked at him with pity, others with shame. The woman smiled smugly, leaning back in her seat as though she had won some great victory. "Yes," she said, nodding. "That would be best for everyone." But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly realize, was that every move, every word, every cruel glance had been watched closely. A man seated just a few rows behind had seen it all. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed firmly on the scene unfolding. He was quiet now, but his silence wasn't weakness. It was the silence of someone weighing what to do. The silence of someone with authority. Someone who would soon step forward. The soldier walked calmly toward the back of the plane, his head bowed slightly. He wasn't ashamed, he was simply tired. He knew fights like this weren't worth it. But deep inside, there was a small ache. Not because he had lost a seat, but because it reminded him that so many people didn't see soldiers as human beings, as fathers, sons, brothers, just as uniforms. He didn't know yet that the story wasn't over. He didn't know that his quiet dignity was about to speak louder than any argument could. He didn't know that the woman who had smiled in triumph would soon face a humiliation greater than she had ever imagined. All because of the man quietly watching from behind. The plane had settled into a quiet hum as the engines roared steadily. But inside the first-class cabin, the air was tight with unease. The soldier, still standing with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, looked calm on the outside, but deep down, he felt the sting of humiliation. Not from her words alone, but from the silence of everyone else. Dozens of eyes had watched the scene, and yet no one had spoken. The woman, still in her seat, leaned back with her arms folded, her lips pressed into a satisfied smile. She believed she had won. In her mind, first class was now safe again and touched by someone she thought unworthy. Her voice carried across the cabin once more, sharp and full of arrogance. "It's only right," she said loudly. "First class should be for those who pay for it, not for charity cases in uniform. It makes other passengers uncomfortable." The soldier paused, his grip tightening on his bag's handle. He didn't want to cause trouble, didn't want to embarrass anyone. His instinct was to walk away quietly, take a seat in the back, and let it go. He had fought battles where silence was survival. Here, silence felt like the easiest path too. But the words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. They weren't just about a seat. They were about dignity. About being dismissed as though his sacrifices meant nothing. He lowered his gaze, swallowing the knot in his throat. The flight attendant stepped forward quickly, her polite smile fading as she faced the woman. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "his seat is assigned here. He has every right to sit in first class." The woman scoffed, her eyebrows arching in disbelief. "Assigned? By mistake, surely." "This." She waved her hand at the soldier dismissively. "This isn't the sort of man who belongs here. Look at him. Do you think he can even afford this?" A murmur spread through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, their guilt growing heavier by the second. They didn't agree with her. Not really, but none of them wanted to be the one to stand up. The soldier, quiet and respectful, had become a mirror, reflecting their own silence back at them. The soldier inhaled deeply. then spoke for the first time, his voice low but steady. "Ma'am, I don't mean to cause any discomfort. If it makes things easier, I'll move." Gasps rippled through the cabin. His humility, his willingness to surrender what was rightfully his, struck some passengers harder than the woman's insults ever could. The businessman who had kept his head buried in his laptop finally glanced up, guilt flickering in his eyes. The young couple held hands tighter, exchanging an uneasy look. The woman smirked in triumph. "Yes," she said, nodding, "that's the proper choice. Back there is where you belong." The soldier nodded politely, shifting his bag to his other shoulder. He didn't look at her again. Instead, he looked down the aisle toward the back of the plane. He took a small step forward, his boots quiet against the carpeted floor. But before he could move further, the flight attendant's voice rang out again, sharper this time. "Sir, please, don't move. Your seat is here." The soldier hesitated, torn. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to make a scene. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'm used to giving up my comfort for others. It's nothing new." Those words, spoken with no bitterness, no anger, just quiet truth, hung in the air like a heavy stone. The woman didn't notice their weight. She only smiled, basking in what she thought was victory. But for others, the words struck deep. From a few rows behind, a man shifted in his seat. His eyes had been fixed on the scene from the very beginning, his silence patient, deliberate. Now he leaned slightly forward, his expression calm but unreadable. The soldier didn't notice him. The woman didn't notice him, but soon they would. The soldier took another step toward the aisle, the duffel bag brushing against his leg. His shoulders were heavy, not with the weight of the bag, but with the weight of injustice. Yet he didn't protest. He didn't demand respect. He carried himself the way he always had, quiet, steady, disciplined. The woman, emboldened, leaned toward the other passengers with a smug laugh. "See? Even he knows he doesn't belong here." Some people need to understand their place. Her words were cruel, laced with venom, but she didn't realize her arrogance was being etched into the memory of every person watching. Her voice was loud enough to fill the cabin, but soon her words would be drowned out by something much stronger: truth. The soldier stopped for a moment. Glancing back at his seat, he wanted to sit there, not because it was first class, but because it was his. He wanted, for once, to be treated as a man who had earned a moment of rest. But his humility pushed him forward again, choosing peace over pride. Little did he know, his refusal to fight back with anger, his quiet dignity, was speaking louder than anything he could have shouted. He didn't know that his silence was being measured, his character being weighed by the watchful eyes behind him. The refusal wasn't his alone, it was hers. She had refused to see him for who he was. She had refused to show respect. Oh, she had refused to understand that true worth isn't measured in money or status, but in sacrifice. And soon she would learn that lesson in the most unexpected way. Because the man watching from behind was about to rise, and when he did, the entire plane would see the truth revealed. The soldier stood in the narrow aisle for a moment, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his head slightly bowed. His broad frame filled the space, yet he carried himself as though he wanted to disappear, to take up less room than he did. The engines rumbled steadily beneath the plane, a low vibration that filled the silence. But inside the cabin, there was another kind of noise and unspoken heaviness. Thick with unease, he had every right to claim his seat. The boarding pass, in his hand, said so. The flight attendant had defended him. Yet still, he moved aside. Not because he agreed with the woman's cruel words, but because years of discipline had taught him that sometimes the quietest response was the strongest. In combat zones, he had learned to hold his tongue when insults flew, to stay calm when tempers burned hot. He had learned that silence could protect, that dignity didn't need to shout, so he stayed silent. The woman mistook his silence for weakness. Her lips curled into a victorious smirk, her chin lifting proudly as if she had proven a point. "That's better," she said, loud enough for those around her to hear. "He knows his place." But the passengers didn't see weakness. They saw something else. They saw the quiet patience of a man who refused to lower himself to her level. Some felt shame stirring in their hearts. Others felt anger but lacked the courage to speak. Their eyes followed him as he stepped toward the back, and they wondered what kind of strength it took to endure such treatment without a single word of retaliation. The flight attendant, her jaw tight, started forward again.
"Sir?"
she said. Firmly, "Please, sit back down. This is your assigned seat." The soldier glanced at her, his expression calm, almost apologetic. "It's all right," he said softly. His voice carried no bitterness, only weariness. "I'm used to it." Those 3 words "I'm used to it" echoed in the cabin like a bell. They weren't shouted, they weren't angry, but they cut deeper than any insult. Passengers exchanged glances, realizing what he meant. He wasn't just used to long flights or giving up comfort. He was used to sacrifice. He was used to being overlooked, dismissed, treated as less than what he was. And yet, he bore it quietly, without complaint. A few rows back, the man who had been watching leaned forward slightly. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. He hadn't missed a word. He hadn't missed the way the soldier carried himself, or the way the woman had spoken, dripping with arrogance. His silence wasn't the same as the others. His silence was deliberate, patient, the silence of someone weighing the moment, waiting for the right time to act. Meanwhile, the woman turned toward the other passengers again, basking in what she thought was support. "You see, even he admits it. He doesn't belong here. First class is for those who work hard and pay for it, not for people who—" She paused dramatically, her eyes flicking over the soldier with disdain. "Who wear a uniform and expect special treatment." The soldier said nothing. He didn't correct her. He didn't remind her that he had spent sleepless nights in freezing deserts, or blistering heat, guarding men and women who never even knew his name. He didn't tell her about the friends he had lost, about the battles he had fought, about the weight he carried home each night. He didn't speak of the scars. No, one could see. He didn't need to. His silence spoke for him. The soldier's silence told the passengers what words could not: that he was stronger than her cruelty, that he was bigger than her insults. His silence wasn't defeat, it was restraint. It was the mark of someone who had seen real battles, who didn't waste energy on small ones. But the other passengers, businessmen, vacationers, professionals, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They realized they had been silent too, but their silence was different. Their silence wasn't strength, it was fear. Fear of speaking up, fear of being targeted, fear of standing out. And now, that fear weighed heavily on them, because the contrast was clear. The soldier's silence was noble. Theirs was cowardice. The plane continued to climb higher, the clouds swallowing the world outside. Inside, the tension remained thick. The woman adjusted her scarf smugly, proud of what she thought was a victory. She didn't know that her words, her arrogance, had revealed far more about her than they ever could about the soldier. The soldier finally lowered his bag and slid it carefully under an empty seat in the back. He sat down quietly, folding his hands in his lap, his eyes lowered. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He simply sat, as he had sat countless times in countless places, waiting patiently for the moment to pass. From the back of the cabin, the view was different. He could see the rows of heads in front of him, the flicker of screens, the shifting shoulders of passengers, too uneasy to look back at him. For a moment, he felt the familiar ache of invisibility, the ache of being overlooked. But he also felt something else, the faint hum of peace inside himself. He had made a choice. He had chosen dignity over pride, humility over confrontation. And though the woman believed she had silenced him, she hadn't. His silence was louder than her words. What he didn't know was that his silence had already been noticed, deeply noticed by the man a few rows back. A man who wasn't just another passenger, but someone who understood exactly who this soldier was and what he represented. And soon, that silence would end not with the soldier's words, but with someone else's voice, a voice that would change everything. The plane cruised steadily through the clouds, the engines humming like a steady heartbeat. The passengers settled into their seats, some opening laptops, others pulling blankets over themselves. Yet the first-class cabin was anything but calm. The atmosphere was heavy, still carrying the echo of the woman's harsh words and the soldier's quiet surrender. Most people tried to pretend the moment had passed. They avoided eye contact, staring at their screens, magazines, or the backs of the seats in front of them. But they couldn't stop glancing sideways, their minds replaying what had happened. The soldier, a man who had given so much, was sitting quietly in the back, while a woman in pearls and perfume sat proudly in the seat that was rightfully his. The injustice hung in the air like smoke. No one wanted to breathe. And yet, not everyone stayed silent. A few rows behind, in a first-class seat near the aisle, a man had been watching since the very beginning. He had seen the soldier board, seen the way the young man carried himself with quiet dignity. He had seen the woman's scornful glances, her sharp voice slicing through the air. And he had seen the soldier's humility in response. Unlike the others, he hadn't looked away. This man was older. His hair touched with gray, his suit perfectly pressed but not flashy. He carried himself with a calm authority, the kind of presence that drew respect without demanding it. To most of the passengers, he looked like another professional traveler, perhaps a businessman or a government official. But there was something about him, something in his eyes that made him different. He sat still, hands folded lightly in his lap, but his gaze never wavered. He studied the soldier, noting every detail, the straightness of his back, even in humiliation, the way his hands rested calmly despite the storm around him, the way his silence carried more weight than the woman's arrogance. It was the silence of a man who had endured greater battles than anyone in that cabin could imagine. The older man's jaw tightened slightly as he turned his gaze toward the woman. She was sipping her wine now, her lips curved in satisfaction, as though she had done something righteous. She had no idea how her behavior reflected on her, no idea that her arrogance had already betrayed her to everyone watching. She sat proud, but her pride was hollow. The man looked back at the soldier, now seated quietly in the back. He noticed the duffel bag tucked carefully under the seat, the scuffed edges that spoke of years of use, the patches on the uniform that told silent stories of sacrifice and service. He felt a deep respect rise in his chest. Around him, whispers began to grow. Two passengers leaned toward each other, murmuring about how unfair it was. A young woman near the window wiped her eyes quietly, moved by the soldier's humility. A businessman shook his head, ashamed that he hadn't spoken up when the woman first began her tirade. The silence of the crowd was breaking, guilt stirring beneath the surface. But the older man didn't whisper. He didn't fidget. He didn't need to. He simply sat with the quiet authority of someone who understood the weight of moments like these. His eyes stayed fixed on the soldier, as though waiting, watching, preparing. The soldier himself seemed unaware. He sat with his head lowered, staring at the seat in front of him, his mind drifting elsewhere. Maybe he was thinking of home, of his family waiting for him. Maybe he was thinking of the friends he had lost, the long nights on foreign soil when comfort was nothing but a memory. Whatever his thoughts were, he didn't show them. He simply sat, silent as always. But the man behind him saw what others could not. Strength disguised as humility, courage hidden beneath quietness. He knew men like this had served beside them, perhaps, or commanded them. He knew the weight they carried and the respect they deserved. And he also knew when it was time to speak. The woman glanced back briefly, her eyes flicking toward the soldier with disdain before turning back to her glass. She was unaware that her every move was being measured, that her arrogance was setting the stage for her own downfall. She thought the matter was settled, that she had removed an inconvenience from her world. But the man watching knew better. He leaned slightly forward in his seat, his hand resting on the armrest, his expression calm but resolute. He was waiting for the right moment, the moment to rise, to break the silence, to turn the woman's false victory into her greatest humiliation. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and relentless. Passengers glanced toward the soldier again, their shame growing heavier. They wondered if they should have spoken, if they should still speak, but none of them moved. They didn't need to, because the man who had been watching from behind was about to do what they could not. And when he did, the entire plane would know the truth. The hum of the plane filled the cabin, steady and constant, but inside first class, the air felt frozen. The woman sat proudly in her seat, sipping her wine as if she had achieved some great victory. Passengers avoided her eyes, but their silence made her believe she was right. She leaned back comfortably, adjusting her silk scarf, certain that she had restored order. The soldier sat quietly in the back, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze lowered. He wasn't bitter, not outwardly. His silence was calm, but it carried the weight of years of sacrifice, of unspoken pain. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone in that cabin. Still, his heart ached not for the seat he had lost, but for the reminder that people could be so blind to what service truly meant. And then, the moment came. A sound broke the stillness, not loud, but enough to draw attention. It was the scrape of a chair as the older man, the silent observer from a few rows behind, rose to his feet. His movements were steady, deliberate, the kind of movements that made people notice even before he spoke. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Even the flight attendants paused mid-step, sensing that something was about to happen. The man straightened his jacket, his posture calm but commanding. His eyes swept across the cabin, sharp and steady, before they landed on the woman. She looked up, frowning slightly at the interruption. "Yes?" she asked, her voice sharp, as though he were bothering her. The man didn't answer her right away. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the soldier in the back. His voice was deep, firm, and carried effortlessly through the cabin. "Young man," he said, "would you please return to your seat in first class?" The soldier looked up, surprised. His brows furrowed slightly as he shook his head. "It's fine, sir," he replied softly. "I don't want any trouble." The man's eyes didn't waver. "It's not fine," he said firmly. "You belong in that seat, more than anyone else here." A ripple went through the passengers. The woman scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "And who exactly are you to decide who belongs in first class?" The man turned his gaze toward her, calm but sharp. "I am the one who has been watching from the moment you opened your mouth," he said evenly. "And I am the one who will not allow your arrogance to go unanswered." Her face reddened, but before she could speak, the man reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a leather case, small and neat. With a practiced motion, he opened it and revealed what was inside. Gasps filled the cabin. It was a badge. A high-ranking military insignia gleamed in the light. The man wasn't just another passenger. He was a decorated general. The woman's smirk vanished instantly, her face draining of color. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The passengers leaned forward in shock, whispering to one another. Suddenly, the quiet, patient man in the aisle wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who commanded respect at the highest level. The general closed the case and slid it back into his jacket with calm precision. His voice carried again, steady and unshakable. This soldier has given more for this country than you could possibly imagine. He has earned not only this seat, but the respect of every person on this plane. The soldier shifted uncomfortably, humility in his eyes. Sir, really, it's all right, he said softly. But the general raised a hand, silencing him with authority. No, son, it is not all right. You've carried enough on your shoulders. You will not carry this insult too. He turned back toward the woman, his gaze piercing. And you, he said sharply, should be ashamed. You judged him by his clothes, by his bag, by what you thought he could afford. But you know nothing of what he has given, of what he has endured, so that you may sit here, sipping your wine in peace. The woman's hands trembled. Her glass rattled against the tray as she set it down. She opened her mouth to protest, but the general cut her off with a single word. Enough. The cabin was silent, the word echoing like a command. Even the flight attendants stood straighter, as if they too had been reminded of the weight of his presence. Then, slowly, the general stepped aside and gestured toward the soldier. Return to your seat, son, he said with quiet respect. First class belongs to you today. The soldier hesitated, but the sincerity in the general's voice left no room for doubt. He stood slowly, his duffel bag in hand, and began walking back down the aisle. The passengers watched him, some with tears in their eyes, others with guilt pressing heavy on their hearts. Few even began to clap softly, their applause hesitant at first, but growing louder as the soldier passed. The woman shrank in her seat, her face burning with humiliation. She stared at her hands, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The proud smirk she had worn minutes ago was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of shame. The soldier reached his original seat, the one he had given up so quietly. The general placed a hand on his shoulder as he sat down. Rest easy, son, he said softly. You've earned it. The cabin filled with quiet applause now, more passengers joining in, their claps steady, respectful. The soldier nodded, humbly, his eyes misty, but he didn't speak. His silence, as always, carried more than words could, and in that moment, a truth was revealed, not just about who the soldier was, but about who the woman truly was, and who the general had always been. The applause in the cabin slowly faded, but the weight of the moment lingered. The soldier sat back in his seat, humbled and quiet, his duffel bag now resting safely above him. The general remained standing in the aisle for a moment longer, his steady gaze fixed on the woman who had caused it all. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting down to her lap, avoiding him, avoiding everyone. But the general wasn't finished. He turned his head slowly, his eyes sweeping across the cabin. The passengers straightened in their seats, waiting, listening. His presence was commanding, his voice calm but filled with authority that could not be ignored. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his tone clear and steady. What you witnessed today was not just about a seat. It was about respect. It was about dignity. He paused, letting his words sink in. This young soldier was willing to give up his place, not because he was wrong, but because humility is stronger than pride. And yet, not one of you stood up for him when he was insulted. The passengers shifted uncomfortably, guilt rising in their faces. Some lowered their eyes, others clasped their hands tightly in their laps. The truth of his words stung deeply. The general continued, his voice softer now, but just as sharp. I have served with men and women like him all my life. They do not ask for recognition. They do not demand thanks. They simply serve, quietly, faithfully, often at great cost. They give you safety so you may live your lives in peace. And this, he gestured toward the soldier, is how they are treated. With scorn, with disrespect. The woman's cheeks flushed crimson. She twisted her hands in her lap, her earlier confidence shattered. She had thought her words were clever, that her arrogance would be admired. Now she sat small, exposed, every eye in the cabin burning into her. The general's gaze locked on her. "And you," he said firmly. "You looked at him and judged him unworthy. You assumed he didn't belong because you measured worth in money, in appearance, in status. But true worth cannot be bought. It is earned in blood, in sacrifice, in service that you cannot begin to imagine." Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. She wanted to defend herself, to argue, but the words died on her tongue. Nothing she could say would undo the truth that had been spoken. The general took a step closer, his voice dropping lower, filled with quiet power. "Every comfort you enjoy, every freedom you take for granted, was paid for by people like him. And yet you dared to strip him of the smallest courtesy, a seat on a plane." He shook his head slowly. "You should be ashamed." The silence in the cabin was absolute. The passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were absorbing every word, every truth. The lesson wasn't just for the woman, it was for all of them. The general straightened, his eyes sweeping across the rows once more. Respect is not given to those who demand it with arrogance. Respect belongs to those who earn it with honor. And if you cannot recognize that, then you do not understand the value of freedom at all. A soft murmur spread through the cabin. A few passengers nodded quietly. Some wiped at their eyes. Others whispered words of agreement under their breath. They knew he was right. They had been silent when they should have spoken. And now their silence weighed heavily. The soldier sat quietly through it all. His eyes lowered, his hands clasped. Together, he wasn't used to such words being spoken about him, about his service. He didn't see himself as a hero. He had simply done his duty. And yet, hearing those words, spoken by a man who carried authority and respect, stirred something. Inside him, the woman lowered her face into her hands, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The pride she had worn so confidently only minutes ago had melted into humiliation. She knew she had been exposed, not just to the general, not just to the soldier, but to everyone on that plane. The general let the silence stretch for a moment, then finally nodded. His voice softened, filled now with calm resolve. "Let this be a reminder," he said. "Do not measure a person's worth by what you see. You have no idea what battles they fought, what sacrifices they've made, what burdens they carry. True greatness is often quiet, hidden in plain sight, like the man sitting among you today." The passengers nodded again, this time with more conviction. A wave of respect filled the cabin, directed not just at the general, but at the soldier, who sat humbly, still not saying a word. The general placed a hand gently on the soldier's shoulder as he returned to his seat. "Rest easy, son," he said quietly, his voice carrying only to him now. "You've done enough. Let us carry the lesson forward." The soldier nodded, his eyes glistening, though he blinked the tears away quickly. He didn't want pity. He didn't want to be the center of attention. But deep down, he felt something he hadn't in a long time seen. Respected, valued, as the general sat back down. The passengers began to clap again, this time louder, stronger, united. The sound filled the cabin, a wave of respect that washed over the soldier. He didn't look up, but he felt it. And for once, silence wasn't his shield, was his honor. The woman sat still, shrinking deeper into her seat, her lesson carved, into her heart for all to see. She had tried to strip away another's dignity. Instead, she had lost her own. And so, the lesson was delivered not just to her, but to everyone on that plane.